Greetings hobby fans, and in this video we're going to look at some painting techniques from 1988. The art dungeons almost seem friendly once you get used to them. A couple of stray beams of sunlight penetrate the gloom, and the damp doesn't bother me that much. This chain is beginning to make my ankle ache though. I wonder if they'll feed me this week. John comes into the room, dragging an unconscious hippie behind him. I shouldn't build my hopes up, but I can't help getting excited. I haven't had fresh meat for ages. The master of Blanche grabs a dusty piece of parchment from a shelf and throws it at me. "Grab your quill and ink then," he growls. "We're going to make a study in red." It's largely a question of attitude. If you want to get the best from your figure, you're going to have to take the appropriate care when painting it. Don't let the size of the figure intimidate you. Some of the things we discuss sound impossible when you think of a miniature that's only 28mm tall, but they're all possible. Work in daylight. You won't be able to trust artificial light to give you the colours you want. The importance of good brushes has been emphasised many times in the past, but cannot be overstressed. Cheap or damaged brushes will let you down no matter how talented or skillful you are. And finally, this work is going to require a great deal of thought and concentration. Rushing the job will result in a second-rate figure, nothing else. The processes we describe are really an extension of what we've talked about before. If you've been practicing some of the techniques outlined in previous articles, you can look at this as the next step. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: the guidelines we talk about are just that. They are not the law. Ultimately, the most important thing for an artist to do is develop his or her own technique. Whether this is a combination of ideas used here or something totally original. Good luck. Smooth surfaces need to be shaded and blended in. Figures may sometimes be too heavily engraved to allow for this, but we discussed the removal of detail for painting purposes before. The intention here is to take advantage of good painting effects. This is often why people make banners or special shields for their miniatures. The result provides them with somewhere to express themselves beyond the immediate constraints of the figure. These often become the focal point of the figure. So the effect you want is subtle, clean, and pleasing to the eye. Basically, this entails building up paint on top of a base colour. There are 3 methods you can use to go about this. All of them require good brushwork, a steady hand, and a mix of paint that's thin enough to flow from the tip of a fine brush. First of all, you could begin with the darkest tone of red. Subsequent layers are brushed increasingly lightly onto raised areas of the model, using increasingly lighter shades of the same colour. Try to avoid using black or white for this. It's been mentioned before, but it's important because this only darkens or lightens the colour, when you really want it to be brighter or deeper. If you were working on a red tunic, mixing amounts of red, purple and blue would darken it, for example. The choice of colour is important. We'll come back to this later. Keep the various tones as close to each other as possible. This way, the blending will be more successful. The disadvantages of this method are that detail can be obscured by the layers of paint, and as the layers of paint are opaque, the figure looks flat and dull. The second method involves adding the shading tones while the base coat is still wet and blending them together. This shares the same disadvantage as the first method, and also suffers from the problem of acrylics drying too quickly for it to work properly. Still, It suits some people and tends to be easier to achieve with enamels. The method most likely to provide pleasing results also tends to involve the most work, but it's worth it. It's an extension of the second method, mixing tones on the figure itself. The key is to make each layer of paint to be translucent, allowing each layer, right down to the undercoat, to shine through. That's how you achieve luminosity. However, there's still this problem of the acrylic drying and evaporating while you're working it into an area. Well, this is partly offset by the thinned paint taking longer to dry, but the school of Blanche also provides us with useful advice. Please take both your arms and rest them on the surface before you at the point commonly known as the elbow. Hold the figure firmly by the base in whichever hand you find suitable. Hold the brush in the other hand and use the thumb of the hand holding the figure as a palette. You may now apply the paint as rapidly as possible, as you are only painting small areas. There should be enough room on the thumbnail. Also know that a lower temperature will allow the paint longer to dry. Note that the guru John Blanche himself is always to be seen wearing a tacky but warm pullover in those silly studio photographs. Well, that's why we only show you excerpts. Anyway, it's more sophisticated than rummaging around in filth, as was suggested last time. Interestingly, the art of Blanchitsu suggests several strange procedures that help you get the best from your brush. A brush reaches its height in terms of usefulness when enough bristles have dropped out to leave only those that come to a point. Eventually, of course, too many bristles drop out, but to ensure as long a life as possible for your little sable familiar, revolving the tip of the brush as it rests lightly on the end of your tongue helps to keep the bristles coming to a point by wrapping them around each other. Or moistening the bristles and running the brush through the folds in a curled palm will have a similar effect. Most of the time, simply tapering the tip with your lips will do the job. Incidentally, Citadel paints are non-toxic. If a brush fails to respond to any of this treatment, you may assume it's an X brush. Its remains are now only suitable for dry brushing. Back to the figure. As you apply each wash, work gradually upwards and outwards from the crease. When you're highlighting, paint onto the raised areas and work the shade down towards the crease. In the case of the red tunic used as an example earlier on, each shading tone wants to be red with increasing amounts of purple and blue, the very deepest tone sitting in the furthest recesses. The highlights are directly opposite, using shades of red highlighted with orange and yellow on raised areas until the finest of the highlights of yellow occupies only the highest points. A second brush, moistened at the tip, will aid the process. Your mouth comes in useful for holding one brush while you use the other. It keeps you quiet as well. Is there no end to the wonder of John Blanche? With all this brush sucking, subtle washing paint work, the chances of you covering the figure at all at once are slim indeed. Good, this is precision work. If you're in a rush, this isn't the technique to use. Again, Blanchitsu refers us to the work of the guru, who estimates an evening a day and then some to work on a 28mm figure from start to finish. Remember, only the tiniest of areas are being covered with the paint, so you need very little of it and work on small areas at a time. This technique applies to the entire figure. When you're satisfied that everything is done, mix a little black and red together, again thinned to translucence, and emphasize the areas by outlining them. Where the shield meets the face is a good example of this. The disadvantage of this method lies in the potential for overworking. The look of the figure is the only important thing, not whether you have done or everything you could possibly can to the model. So, If at any time in the process you're satisfied with the results, stop right there. Earlier on, we mentioned that the mix of colours was very important when it came to shading, just as complementary colours work well together, so can opposing ones. We brought this up when we looked at Mike McVey's dragons before. A green wash used to shade a pink base colour would be suitable on undead or monsters, for example. A green shade on a pale grey base always has striking results. These are the areas you can experiment in. Contrast washes can be put to more subtle use on the conventional figure. How about patches of rust on armour or rosy cheeks on a face? Sometimes the tonal ranges can be overstated through shading. This is not necessarily undesirable. It depends largely on how you want to look at your figures. More extremely toned figures work better at a distance, but the subtle effect suits a closer inspection. If the tonal range seems overstated, something like a delicate sepia wash provides that final blending in. If you painted the figure opaquely, this final wash can add a touch of brilliance to the figure, yellow over reds for example. Remembering that it's all down to taste, let's backtrack a little and talk about decoration. Long gone are the days when orcs were only dressed in loincloths or sackcloth. In a twisted attempt to climb the social ladder, many of these obnoxious little gobbos have progressed to wearing trousers. Given that they can show this much bad taste in street cred, why can't the trousers be stripy? On the other side of the Badlands Gap, you have the elves, who no longer dress in robes, but have business-like armour and punk haircuts, often sporting a wealth of colour. You can add stripes if your hand is steady enough and apply all the techniques we have discussed. Highlight the stripe down the middle and deepen towards the edges. Checkerboard and brocade patterning can line a cloak or jacket, or even constitute the main design on the trousers. Yuck! It's up to you. As checkerboard is a popular pattern, the easiest way to achieve it is to draw it on with a Rotring Isograph 0.13 available from art shops. The mistake most people make with these is pressing too hard or trying to add the pattern while the paint below is still wet. Either way, you'll only bung up the nib of the pen. The surface needs to be smooth and dry, and you must let the ink flow naturally from the nib to the model. After that, it's down to experience. In fact, many people fail to achieve results that please themselves because they are too heavy-handed. A lightness but firmness of hand is required. Learning patience and giving yourself a good working environment are almost as important as practice at painting the figures themselves. Now, there's only one thing left: faces. The important thing to remember is that we're dealing with fantasy. The faces should look dramatic and therefore lend themselves to exaggeration. Cast your mind or eyes back to the last time where we discussed flaring the nostrils and so on. Beginning with the flesh tone itself, we recommend mixing this from white, yellow, red and a little green, rather than using the same colour in the pot. This allows some variation of pigmentation between figures, making a group look more natural. An orange and brown mix provides a suitable shading tone. Eye sockets should be the darkest area. Perhaps black is suitable for this. It may sound extreme, but the process is comparable to makeup in film or television. People who aren't made up look flat or washed out. Highlights should be almost white and added to the bridge of the nose and across the forehead. The oval of the eye is painted white and a black pupil added. Some people use different colours for pupils when they're painting elves and so on. This is fine when the figures are under close inspection, but the effect is lost at a distance. A blending wash can be added to the sides or top of the ovals to create the effect of eyelids. This offers each character the chance to look individual and stops all your characters from appearing pop-eyed. Adding a white highlight just off-center of the pupil is difficult, but not impossible. Not only do you have to hold your breath and be very accurate, but even getting the paint off the brush in the right amount now becomes tricky. The price of perfection. Zooming out a little, eyebrows may be painted in black and highlighted appropriately. Nostrils and mouth need to be painted dark brown, assuming the mouth is open. Teeth are dirty white and highlighted in white. Lips are painted with a flesh mix with added red. Pure red will just make the figure look as though it's wearing lipstick. If the mouth is closed, a red-brown line between the lips is wanted. Add zits and other nastiness to taste. Always work in the colour. Even though you might want to add the tiniest of boils, a spot of colour can ruin the face, so blend everything in with its surroundings. Don't forget 5 o'clock shadows. How many times have your party stopped to have a shave while they've been down a dungeon? A blue-black wash gives a healthy unshaven look, but if you're a sucker for punishment, grab that isograph pen and try using that instead. Okay, you can come out now, we're finished. Now sit back and enjoy the results. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, then please be sure to like and subscribe, or even leave a comment. I always try my best to reply to them all. You can even now support the channel by joining the Patreon page, details of which are in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and always remember to drill your barrels.